Welcome to my talk about modeling nuclear reactors. I have had a lot of fun in grad school, thanks in large part to CSGF. Obviously, I have been busy making high-fidelity models of complex neutron transport, but I have also been heavily involved with the American Nuclear Society doing tons of things, including STEM outreach for children. And of course, I made sure to fit in lots of shenanigans with my research group. So this is actually a picture of us in front of a graphite pile at MIT. I had time to fit in several practicums at Los Alamos National Lab. I love this place, and it's not just because I met my husband in Los Alamos, but I was also able to do some pretty cool work there too. I did an undergraduate internship followed by 2 CSGF practicums. Each of those resulted in a conference publication. By the way, this is me and Seth in our feeble attempt to recreate a famous photo of Oppenheimer and Groves at the site of the first nuclear weapons test. This was a trip we were able to take a couple years ago, a very fascinating and sobering place to be. Now, since I don't expect many of you to be nuclear engineers, I will start out with some basics. How do nuclear engineers apply Monte Carlo to neutronics? And how do nuclear reactors work anyway? Then, armed with that background, we can jump into the computational nitty-gritty of numerical methods. In Monte Carlo neutronics, we solve the neutron transport equation by individually modeling each neutron in the system. For example, here's a neutron that is streaming through a material and it's about to hit a nucleus. Many things could happen after that collision: elastic scattering, inelastic scattering, capture, etc. And we know the cross-section for each of those reactions, which is basically just a probability of the event occurring based on the incoming energy of the neutron. So for each event, we look up the cross-sections, line them up, and then randomly sample the outcome. As you can imagine, repeating this process countless times for millions of neutrons is very expensive. And Monte Carlo is expensive, but it's also the most accurate tool in the shed. So it is really the gold standard. Nuclear fuel comes in the form of little pellets of uranium oxide. These pellets are lined up and loaded up into a long a fuel rod. These fuel rods are about 14 feet tall. These rods are then placed in a square assembly, which is held together by spacer grids. And here's a photo of a spacer grid. Then the assemblies themselves are loaded into a huge pattern that forms the reactor core. Once it's all together, this is what the reactor core looks like, with the fuel down here, and up here are control rods. The control rods are filled with neutron absorbing materials. So when they're inserted in the reactor, they absorb neutrons and stop the reactions. If you wanted to fully resolve a single fuel pellet using Monte Carlo neutronics, you would need about a CPU hour. When you go to a fuel rod, this quickly becomes a CPU day maybe, and then an assembly takes about a CPU year. And to really fully resolve everything in a whole reactor core easily takes more than a CPU decade. And keep in mind that these times are only for steady state simulations of neutron transport alone. Forget multiphysics, forget time-dependent behavior. These are really high-cost, high-fidelity simulations. Well, my PhD is all about bringing multiphysics transient Monte Carlo simulations to life. Since we are talking about transients, it's important to know how we model transients in a nuclear reactor. The first thing you might be wondering is, how can we control reactors? During the fission process, when a neutron bombards a heavy nucleus, that nucleus splits into 2 smaller nuclei. It also releases excess neutrons. These neutrons live for much, much less than a second. which suggests a period of only 0.1 seconds for any reactor changes, which is completely not feasible for a human to be able to intervene in that time. Thankfully, about 1% of emitted neutrons from fission are delayed. These delayed neutrons are emitted from the unstable fission products. These two nuclei that are a product of fission, they are unstable and they will release a delayed neutron in order to stabilize. This delay increases the overall period of the reactor to about 85 seconds, which is definitely feasible for a mechanical system to control. In steady state simulations, we don't need to differentiate between prompt and delayed neutrons because they're all in equilibrium. But in a transient simulation, the delayed neutrons become crucial. In steady state Monte Carlo, then, we start with a random distribution of neutrons, which I illustrate here. But as we follow the neutrons throughout generations of their lives, where they're causing fission, getting absorbed, birthing new neutrons, etc., the distribution of neutrons will move from a random distribution to their true distribution in the system over time. We need to sample millions of neutrons for this process to be accurate. Now, when we go to transient simulations, now we have those fission products that we need to track because they are going to give us the delayed neutrons. And when you model them explicitly like this, this is called the dynamic Monte Carlo method. The neutrons die off very quickly on the order of 10 to the minus 4 seconds, but the fission products live for several seconds. So this is a big discrepancy in the time. And keep in mind that we create fission products at every single fission that occurs in the system. Now, remember that we needed millions of neutrons for a steady state calculation. Well, now we have thousands more precursors than neutrons at any given time in the reactor because they are building up, whereas neutrons are dying off quickly. So this quickly becomes a huge headache, memory-wise and computationally, to track everything like this. But it is straightforward and people do it, but it's not realistic to model very long transients. So I have turned my attention primarily to high order, low order schemes, where in the high order method, we're going to use Monte Carlo. That means it's very high fidelity, but it's very expensive. And we're only going to use that once in a while during the transient. The gaps are going to be filled in with a more rudimentary solver, such as neutron diffusion. In order to do this, we decompose the flux that we're solving for into a shape and amplitude function. The amplitude is assumed to change much faster than the shape. So the expensive shape function calculations can occur infrequently using Monte Carlo, and the amplitude calculations happen frequently in diffusion. Now, the neutron transport equation is, like many equations, just a balance of loss and gain terms of neutrons. And at steady state, Monte Carlo does a really good job sampling each of these terms. However, when you take this to transient, this time derivative term shows up. And you also have to couple the neutron flux equation with an equation that dictates the concentration of fission products in the system. It is difficult for Monte Carlo to sample a time derivative accurately. So an approximation for the time derivative is often required. And I'm really going to focus on presenting to you what we call the omega method, which proposes a frequency approximation to the time derivative. In this approximation, the time derivative of the flux is modeled as a frequency, a prompt frequency, or a flux frequency. And the time derivative of the fission products, it has its own separate frequency. Now, keep in mind, we can also use frequencies to model a separate frequency for each group. So we have groups of fission products as well as energy groups in the flux. So each of those gets its own frequency. We can also make a frequency for every spatial mesh in the system. This is very good because the fission products are spatially distributed in the system. So having a fission product frequency for each cell allows us to model that very well. The way it works is the diffusion carries out here. And when it's time to go back to Monte Carlo, the diffusion calculation figures out what the frequency is at that time and sends that information to Monte Carlo. Remember, Monte Carlo isn't very good at sampling time derivatives, but now it doesn't have to because the frequency, which is the approximation for the time derivative, comes from the diffusion as input. Now Monte Carlo can focus on sampling the other terms in the equation, which it is good at doing. This is what the communication scheme looks like. We have Monte Carlo, which runs on a fine mesh. And actually, Monte Carlo doesn't actually need a mesh at all. It can use the true geometry of the system. And we have our diffusion, a coarse mesh finite difference solver, which does use a mesh. Now, Monte Carlo has challenges in calculating time derivatives, but that information will be sent from diffusion in the form of frequencies, which carry the prompt and delayed neutron information. The challenge for the diffusion solver is to have good diffusion parameters, such as diffusion coefficients, currents of neutrons between cells, and cell average properties. Well, Monte Carlo can tally that very accurately and send that information to the diffusion solver. If you pull the frequencies out of the system, so if you X out this arrow, the omega method, which does include frequencies, collapses down to the adiabatic method, which does not include frequencies. So in our results, we are going to compare that adiabatic and omega method against each other. Our results are generated on a common reactor benchmark where we have 4 assemblies of fuel. UO2 and MOX are just 2 different kinds of uranium fuel. And it's surrounded by water as a moderator. You'll notice that there are reflected boundary conditions here. So this is a quarter core. You can imagine it being repeated all around. And this is what the fuel assemblies look like. So we have a mesh here, which isolates each fuel pin. So here, every square represents a fuel pin surrounded by water. And that is what forms the assembly. The transient that is going to be carried out has to do with the density of the water. So if we have water density starting at 100% of its initial value, we're going to see that drop down to 80% over the course of 1 second, and then rise again back to the original value over the course of another second. There are several scenarios, but we're going to really focus on this most extreme case, dropping down to 80%. And the water density isn't going to change uniformly in the entire reactor. We're just going to do it here in the first quadrant. That allows us to have kind of a spatial tilt to this transient, and that way we'll be able to tell if the spatially distributed frequencies are having a good effect on our modeling or not. When we compare the core reactivity, which is a global parameter for this transient, we see that there is a significant and visible difference between the omega method and the adiabatic method. What's really interesting, though, is looking at the spatial distribution of the error. We see that the error is highest at 5% here in the assembly that is experiencing the transient. In other words, the adiabatic method is not capturing the spatial tilt of this problem, whereas the omega method is, because each of these cells has a frequency associated with it. And sure enough, when we look at the frequencies, and we have the frequencies for the fission products, and we have a frequency for every cell in the problem, and for 8 different types of fission products in the system, we see that each group does have their highest value of frequencies in the assembly of the water density drop. In other words, the frequencies are doing their job. They're helping to resolve the spatial resolution of this transient. So the omega method really is the bridge that we need between simple solvers like diffusion and high fidelity solvers like Monte Carlo. This method allows for modeling transients of about 10 seconds long, which might seem short, but keep in mind that with the direct Monte Carlo method, it's hard to resolve even a full second. This work is currently implemented in OpenMC, which is our open source Monte Carlo code. It was originally developed at MIT in my research group, but it's now maintained by staff scientists at Argonne National Lab. So you can find us on GitHub and check out my work. But you might have noticed in my example that I prescribed exactly how the water density was going to change. A more sophisticated implementation would allow for the transient to progress naturally, where the feedback between the neutronics and a thermal fluid solver would allow the water density to evolve naturally. This is exactly what I'm doing for my PhD and why I can't graduate right away. I'll be in grad school for about another year answering our remaining questions. Today, I have presented to you mostly this part of the coupling scheme, where Monte Carlo and a coarse mesh finite difference solver are coupled to advance neutronics in time. Early on in grad school, I focused on this coupling between Monte Carlo and the thermal fluid solver at steady state. So the remaining question is, how do we propagate thermal fluids properties in a way that is compatible with how the neutronics is evolving? Will we use numerical methods like predictor corrector to jump between these outer time steps? Or will we come down and communicate more often with diffusion? These are the open questions that I'm really looking forward to answering starting this summer. Thank you.